Ebionite is really an interesting word. You can search the New Testament in vain to find out about the term. It's out there, but never really mentioned in the New Testament. However, in the famous Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does say, "Blessed are you," plural, "poor ones." And ebionite, ebionim in Hebrew, means the poor ones. And Isaiah is the one who uses the term when he says, "God rules heaven and earth, and you couldn't build me a house, but I will look to those that are poor in spirit." So we get the phrase, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." The humble ones, something like that. So who are the humble ones? And how would they get a name like that? Other than that reference, and I don't even know if that's a technical capital name, blessed are the Ebionites. I don't think he's talking like that. We get descriptions from their enemies. It's generally the people that hated and disliked them. Later in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century CE, the so-called church fathers. The main source is Epiphanius, who writes, "Against all heresies." So if we go to Epiphanius, "Against all heresies," and he's naming all these groups that are of the devil and of Satan, Christian groups, in quotes to him, because he thinks they're all teaching error and so forth. Ebionites are named, as well as Nazarenes. So we're going to talk about Ebionites and Nazarenes. Now, usually the Ebionites are seen as the worst because they reject Paul. He says that. They also say Jesus was just a human being. They don't have any virgin birth story. They use the Gospel of Matthew, but guess what? When they start their Matthew, it doesn't have the Christmas story. It just starts out with Jesus teaching, and much like Mark. So those first 2 chapters, according to these sources, and it's not just Epiphanius, other sources like Jerome, they say, they use a Matthew that doesn't have the birth story of Jesus being of a virgin and that sort of thing. So human Jesus, Joseph is the father. They reject the temple and animal sacrifices. They're vegetarians. He tells you all of this. And they particularly believe that Jesus became the Christ. They do think he's the Christ, but only at his baptism. So as he grows and lives up to age, in his 20s, until he's baptized by John the Baptist, he's just an ordinary human being. He's not really divine at that point, but we'll look at a text later. I'm going to read you some of the actual Ebionite texts that we have. And he hears a voice, and the voice doesn't just say, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." That's in our Greek Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You know what it also says? "You are my Son, this day have I begotten you." And the Holy Spirit comes down, and I guess you could just say, begotten, impregnates him with the divine essence. So he becomes divine, but as an adult at his baptism. No pre-existence, nothing like later Trinitarian theology. So you can see why Epiphanius, Jerome, Augustine, others would not particularly like the Ebionites. Also, they think Paul is a heretic. I think I mentioned that. They don't use the letters of Paul, but it isn't just that they don't use them. So if you want to get opposite of Marcion, go to an Ebionite. Marcion would say, "Letters of Paul are everything. Here's my distilled version of the new gospel." And the Ebionites would say, "You've got things so backward. You're the extreme version of everything that's wrong." And of course, Marcion would say that back to them, this Judaizing group and so forth. So sometimes it's called Jewish Christianity, but that's really a mouthful. Or Judeo-Christian. We have all these hyphenated ways of saying it. Look, the Jesus movement is Jewish. It's a Jewish movement within late Second Temple Judaism. And To call it Christianity at an early stage is kind of misleading. And if we're going to try to figure out who they were in, say, the 2nd century, early on, before they were just completely rejected and castigated, or even in the late 1st century CE, then we can find some more positive references, perhaps. For example, Matthew, in his Greek gospel that we have, says, don't think I came, this is Jesus speaking, don't think I came to destroy the Torah and the prophets. I tell you, whoever looses one of the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah, will be least in the kingdom, and whoever does and teaches them will be great. Ebionites would love that. They would say, absolutely. And what you're doing with your Gentile Christianity is loosing the Torah and telling Jews that they don't need to observe the Torah. They're preserved not by name, but by ideology in the book of Acts. Remember those believers in the book of Acts, Derek, that kind of dog Paul, and they think Paul's too liberal and he's teaching Gentiles the gospel. But remember, their real problem is, at least in the book of Acts, okay, Gentiles, we agree, they can go under what was called the laws of Noah. It's a form of the Torah that's more universal. Don't commit adultery. Don't be an idolater. Don't be sexually immoral. Don't be cruel to animals, that sort of thing. Don't steal. Don't lie. Basic laws that most cultures would probably agree with. That isn't what they're worried about. They want to say to Paul, but when you're alone with your Jewish followers, do you tell them that they don't have to keep the law? Because then you're contradicting Jesus. Because he said, if you loose the law, then you're going to be least in the kingdom. And that phrase doesn't mean they're going to be there.